So with that large amount of content out of the way, the next step we want to take is making the law more useful. So we want to understand how the law operates and how lawyers think about and use the law. The objective is not to turn us into lawyers. It's actually more to give us an insight into their thinking and approach, the analytical approach, so that we can use advice that we get more appropriately in business decisions. At times, that might mean we want to actually look at the law or find the law to understand it. It also means we need to understand how lawyers interpret the law and how they then apply it, what kind of legal structure and thinking. They have benefits in terms of our thinking ability that goes beyond this course, so I think that they're useful skills in and of themselves. But that's the overarching idea of today, to give us a bit of a sense of how to find the law and then how it's used. So let's get into it. So as we were saying, what we want to do is revise the sources of law and where they can be found, understand how we interpret legal citations. That gives us a sense of where the law comes from, who's doing it, what it might actually mean. Then we want to understand the doctrine of precedent. This is a critical element of our legal system to understand the common law system. Okay, it's quite different about the common law system, and it's something we need to understand. That is dealing with cases and how we have rules evolve from cases. We also want to know what happens if a statute is unclear. So we're going to look at statutory interpretation, and we're just going to give 4 example approaches. Okay, so we're not going to do it in detail, but give us a sense of how lawyers and judges approach a statute, particularly if it's unclear. Then we're going to look at a model for legal thinking that we use in the rest of the course, the ILAC method, before we finally finish with a little bit about alternative dispute resolution. So let's have a look at the sources of law and where we can find them. So last week we outlined that there are 2 sources of law. One, acts of parliament made by the legislature, and 2, cases, common law sense 2. So we know that law made by parliament is called legislation or a statute or an act of parliament, and that law making can be delegated to another body. That's called delegated legislation. We might call that a regulation. Yeah? Now, we also know that law can be made by the courts. So the recorded decisions of judges are usually published, except for the lower courts. And the doctrine of precedent says other courts need to follow what those judges decided when it is a superior court. So we'll come back to that. This is about the doctrine of precedent. But what we need to remember is that when the courts make a decision, they're actually making law. So this is a body of law made by the judges called common law sense 2. Really important to remember that if there's a conflict between legislation and case law, legislation prevails. And the basic idea here is that legislation comes from the elected officials. So it's more the will of the people rather than unelected people. Okay. So therefore, legislation beats common law. And that way, people can be elected in order to change the law and then make those changes knowing the courts can't override them. Now, one of the things we're going to do in this course is have a look at some different areas of law that are related, but that use different sources of law. So some areas of law rely on legislation. Some just rely purely, almost entirely on case law, and some are a mix. So we're going to use Australian consumer law to look at a piece of particular legislation. When we do contract law, we're mainly going to rely on case law. And when we do negligence, we'll see we use a mix of the 2. Now look, even where you do rely on legislation, that legislation needs to be interpreted. So one of the things when we get into the Australian consumer law that you'll see is that there are cases that apply it and provide examples and clarification. Okay, so the two sources of law, like we deal with them independently, like we discuss them like they're independently, they actually interrelate to each other. Now, in terms of sources of law, there are many sources and insights you can get from all different sources. We're really only going to deal in this course with primary legal materials, with legislation and case law. You can look at secondary legal materials like textbooks, journal articles, dictionaries, encyclopedias, but we're mainly going to look at where do you find and research these primary legal materials, because these are really just interpretations of the primary legal materials. These are the source, and the actual law is in legislation or case law.